Hello, future marine biologists. This is Professor Lyons, and you're watching another exciting video on marine biology. So what we're going to be going through in this video is chapter 17 of the textbook. So the chapter that is all about important resources that come from the ocean. And what this picture is that's me catching a resource from the ocean. Right, so that is a lionfish. So that lionfish was then, after I caught it, it was turned into fish tacos. So of course, one of the really important resources we get from the ocean is food. So of course, marine animals and plants and such are used for a lot of very important things, a lot of commercial products, right? So of course, we use living marine things for food. We use them for some pharmaceutical products. For instance, there's something known as bryostatin, which comes from a what's known as a bryozoan. And this is a bryostatin is a compound, that's it there, and this is a bryozoan. And it's got some potential anti-cancer, anti-AIDS, memory enhancement properties to it. So there is a lot of potential compounds out there amongst marine organisms that could be used for pharmaceutical products. Some other materials that come from living marine animals. These are plates that are used for microbiology research for growing bacteria. In that kind of like grayish film you see in the bottom is actually made of algae. So that's another material that comes from the ocean, from living things. And of course, recreation. So like living things, in aquaria or for fishing or such like things like that. Living marine organisms are used for recreation as well. So living marine organisms are used for a lot of different things. So what we're going to focus on in this chapter mostly is on food that comes from the sea, because that is arguably the most important resource that we get from the ocean. So if you were first just some kind of general statistics to kind of show you what most of this food is and why it's so important. So if you look at all of the harvested animals that come from the ocean, harvested animals and plants, I should say, most of it is finfish, right? So these are mostly bony fishes, but also some cartilaginous fishes. So these are fishes that have fin. And those account for the majority of what we harvest from the ocean. There are then the shellfishes, so these include the various mollusks and crustaceans, things that have shells or a hard exoskeleton. They're probably then maybe 9.5% of the total things we harvest. And then there are the kind of softer animals in the seaweeds, right? So sea urchins, sea cucumbers, jellyfishes, seaweeds, these are other things that people consume from the ocean, but in much less abundance than like, the shellfish or the finfish. So that's a little bit on what it is we eat from the ocean, a little bit on why those things are important. Is that if you look at all of the humans on the earth, which is somewhere around like 7.2 billion people or so right now, roughly a quarter of those, so like 1.5 billion people, get nearly 20% of their protein from the ocean. Right, so there is a huge number of people that get a lot of their protein from the ocean, particularly if you look at people that live, like on island nations. Think of people in places like Indonesia, or places like New Zealand or places like Hawaii. People in those areas get a huge amount of their protein from the ocean. So 1.5 billion people get 20% of their protein from the ocean. 3 billion people get at least 15% of their protein from the ocean, right? So that's roughly half of all humans on the planet, or almost half of all humans on the planet getting at least 15% of their protein from the ocean. So the oceans are a really big source of protein for humans worldwide, which is why it is so important to understand a little bit more about where this food is coming from, and to learn a little bit more about how we can make sure that that food that is coming from the ocean will continue to be there for future generations. So a lot of why we're getting so much protein out of the sea right now is because the human population is increasing over time. Right, so this is showing the total number of humans on the planet from 3000 BC until present. This is what's classically referred to as the hockey stick curve, because very, very low numbers of humans until, sometime in the 1800s, we surpassed a billion humans, and now the number is just, skyrocketing. So even since when I was born, so I was born in the mid 80s, and there's 2 billion more people on the planet now than there was in the mid 80s when I was born, right? So there's way more humans, right? Probably a lot of you were born around the late 90s or early 2000s, and there's a billion more humans on the planet now than there was when you were born, right? So we are adding lots and lots of more humans to the total, Earth population, which means that we need more and more protein from the sea to feed all of these people. Okay, and so then this is kind of showing some more worldwide trends. So what we're seeing is that this in the kind of tan color is the amount of fish being caught. So the amount of fish and shellfish being caught from the ocean. And you can see starting in the 70s and up through the 90s, it was kind of steadily increasing, right? So as human populations were going up, they're catching more and more fish. And then that kind of flatlined around the mid 90s. So around the mid 90s, we stopped being able to catch more fish. And we'll talk a little bit more later about why it is that this curve is now flat. Whereas up until the early 90s, it was increasing, catching more and more fish each year. But starting in the early 90s, the curve is pretty much flat, right? So each year we're not catching more and more fish than we had the year before. Whereas up until the early 1990s, that was the case. However, what is definitely increasing is aquaculture. And we're going to talk a lot more about that later, but aquaculture is essentially farming animals in the sea. So we are doing more and more aquaculture each year, whereas the amount of things that the live, like free roaming things that we're catching from the ocean, we're not catching any more of those than we did in the past. This is showing worldwide trends on a kind of country by country basis. And there's kind of some interesting trends going on here, right? So for instance, if you look at our total trends, so we're in this blue hatched mark, we kind of increased steadily through the 90s, and now we've been kind of slowly decreasing over time. If the You see the kind of the same with Japan, right? So quite a bit of fishing until the 90s, and then steadily decreasing. You see with like Peru, you see a lot of kind of going up and down, kind of booms and busts. That's a lot of why that is because the primary thing that is caught in Peru is the anchoveta, and that fish, during El Nino years really suffers, and then during La Nina years does really well. So there's a lot of up and down with that. Probably the most stark things that we see here is you see a lot of countries that have kind of steadily declined, such as Japan, former Soviet Union, now Russia, but you see China has increased a lot, right? So as the population of China has gotten greater and greater, they have really ramped up their amount of fishing. So this black line is China, and you see it going up and up and up until the early 90s, when then it kind of flatlines. So pretty much all countries now, they're all flatlined. They're not able to catch any more fish than they were in the past. Whereas up until the early 90s, things were relatively good. And China is now by far the world leader in catching fish. Whereas back in the 70s, it was really more Japan, USSR, and Peru. So let's talk a little bit more about the major fisheries in the US. So a lot of the things that we're catching in the US include things like pollock and hake. These are what are generally referred to as ground fish because they tend to be near the seafloor in cold parts of the ocean. So this is mostly like up off of like Canada and like up off well, I guess that's Canada there. So I guess these aren't completely major U.S. fisheries, but North American fisheries in general. So a lot of these ground fishes, like these things, along with halibut, is a ground fish. Salmon is caught a lot and raised a lot, especially on the west coast. Of course, in the Gulf, there's lots of shrimp. We have herring and menhaden, which are kind of oily, small fish that you find a lot of more on the East Coast than on the West Coast. So these are kind of the main things that we're catching throughout North America. If we then focus in on California, the things that we're catching the most of include this crab, the Dungeness crab. It includes spiny lobster. It includes various types of tuna. It includes some salmon like Chinook salmon. It includes this thing is what's known as a sablefish. And so I want you to think about these, animals here, and then think about, them along with these other ones, things like squid and swordfish and sea urchins. Think about which one of those do you think might be the most valuable fishery in California, right? So I want you to, before I reveal which one is actually the most economically, worthwhile, which one of these do you think might actually be the most important fishery? And in terms of economics, believe it or not, it's actually the squid. So the squid fishery, at least in 2015, was valued at $2.4 million, which is quite a bit more than a lot of the other things that are caught in California, right? We would tend to think that something larger like salmon or swordfish or tuna would be really, really valuable fisheries, but it's actually squid is the most valuable. And a lot of why that is because when you go to a lot of restaurants, they have squid as an appetizer, right? So there's calamari as appetizers at a lot of seafood restaurants and just general restaurants. So squid is the king in terms of fisheries in California. Okay, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how fish are actually caught. And then we'll talk a little bit about how fishing is regulated. We'll talk about whether or not those regulations are working, and we're talking about what the sort of future might look like for fisheries. So first, let's talk about how fish are caught. So probably one of the most ancient forms of catching fish is with nets, right? So a net is put out and it catches fish in various ways. So one type of netting that is done is what's known as gill nets. So these are nets where the holes in the net are big enough for a fish to stick its head through, but it can't get its gills through it. So essentially it gets trapped in the net by its gills. And so there are drifting gill nets that just kind of hang from the surface and that fish will accidentally swim into. And then there are bottom gill nets that will be on the sea floor that fish will swim into. These are often done in estuaries, in places where, say, a salmon are swimming up into an estuary to go into a river, and then they'll get caught by these gill nets as they're going up. Another type of netting method is what's known as the purse seine, in which a sort of purse, like a bag, is kind of made out of the net. How that essentially works is a fishing boat actually, drives in a circle, and as it does, it places out the net. So it makes this kind of circle of net, and so any of the fish that are inside of that circle will get caught. The net is then kind of closed on the bottom, so it's completely closed, and so the fish are trapped in there, and then the net is slowly brought in over the side of the boat. So gill nets stay in place, whereas purse seine nets are actually laid out and are actually kind of constricted on themselves. Then there are the trawling variety of net. So with those, the boat is actually moving and actually moving the net through the water. So there are midwater trawls where the net is not on the seafloor, and then bottom trawls where the net is actually on the seafloor being dragged over the seafloor. And so of all the fishing methods that we will talk about, these bottom trawls are probably the most damaging, which makes sense if you're dragging something that is heavy along the seafloor and kind of crunching the seafloor. That is, of course, a very damaging type of fishing. Then there are some fishing methods that include hooks, right? So there are the long line fishing methods where you can either put out a bunch of hooks that are all on the surface or a bunch of hooks that are on the bottom. All of those hooks have bait on them. And then after a period, of a couple hours or maybe a couple of days, the fishermen go back and collect all the fish that have bit onto those hooks and taken the bait. So that's what long lining is. It's one continuous, very long line with many, many hooks coming from them. And then some of the other fishing methods includes harpooning, Not done too much these days, but in the olden days, people used to harpoon a lot for like things like swordfish or tunas. Of course, back when people were still whaling, this was the principal method that whales were caught. There are various types of metal traps or pots that are put out. So what you see here is a bunch of spiny lobster that are inside of a lobster pot. How these essentially work is there is an opening that the lobsters can climb into to get a bait, but once they're inside, then they're stuck and they can't get back out. With varying degrees of efficiency. It has actually been found that a lot of lobsters are smart enough to get back out of them, but maybe not all lobsters are able to get back out of them. So anyway, those are lobster traps or lobster pots. They're essentially allow things to go in, but once they're in, it's harder for them to get out. Underwater spearfishing, is another way of catching fish, right? So that's what you see me doing there. Hook and line is a type of fishing that is different from long lining, in that with long lining you have one individual long line with many hooks that are attached to it, whereas hook and line fishing is just one line, one hook, right? So you can only catch one fish at a time, like this bonefish, as opposed to catching many fish at a time. And then, of course, there's just using your hands, right? So a lot of lobsters, a lot of times how they are caught is just going down with scuba diving, or just just holding your breath, and just grabbing that lobster off the seafloor. Which of all the different types of fishing I've ever done, that is probably the most exciting, because lobsters don't like to be grabbed when they're on the seafloor. So they put up quite a bit of a fight when you try to do that with them. So anyway, that's some of the various types of fishing methods that exist. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how fishers are regulated, about some of the regulatory tools. So kind of a general principle that for a long time has been applied to fishing, into how we regulate fishing, is what is known as the maximum sustainable yield. And kind of there's kind of some guiding principles behind this idea of the maximum sustainable yield. So one guiding principle is that marine species are renewable resources, right? Because they are living things, they have sex, they have little baby fish, and so they renew themselves, right? So just like something like wind power, right? Wind power is renewable because there's always more and more wind. And it's the same with fish, right? So fish produce more fish. So that resource renews itself. As opposed to a non-renewable resource, something like oil, right? There's only a limited amount of oil that is buried in the earth, and that oil is not currently renewing itself, whereas fish do renew themselves. So we can catch those fish, but in order to do so, in order for that fishery to keep perpetuating itself and for people to be able to keep catching fish, it has to be done so in a sustainable way. And so to catch fish sustainably, to have your yield of fish caught in a sustainable way, it has to be such that the amount of fish being caught maintains a constant population size of fish. Because if you're catching fish in such a way that the population size is going down, then eventually the population just keeps going down and down and down until it eventually ceases to exist. So catching fish in a sustainable way means that the fish are being caught in numbers that is not reducing their population. And kind of how that works is that we can think about the number of fish being produced and through reproduction, and the number of fish being caught. Right, so with a population of fish, they're reproducing and making new baby fish each year. So if the number of new baby fish that are produced each year is, say, 100, as long as you don't catch more than 100 fish each year, then in theory that population should stay at that same size. Because you're catching less than 100 fish a year, and the population is making more than 100 fish per year. So that population will stay right there. It's not gonna, it in theory shouldn't go down. Kind of a good way to think about this is to think of a savings account, right? So like a savings account that you might have at a bank, you have the principal amount of money that you put into that savings account. In each year, that savings account accumulates interest. So say you put $1,000 into a savings account, and the interest on that account is 5%. What that means is that each year, $5, I'm sorry, $50 is gonna accumulate in interest to your account. And so if each year you take out of that account less than $50, then that account is going to keep growing and will always stay above $1,000. If, however, you take out more than $50, now you are taking out more money from it than is produced through interest, meaning that the size of the account is going to go down below $1,000. It's going to get smaller and smaller. So kind of the guiding principle behind maximum sustainable yield is that you only catch as many fish as being produced by reproduction. So if the fish are reproducing 100 new fish per year, as long as you catch less than that 100, then the population is going to stay the same. Okay, so let's add one more additional wrinkle to this, because maximum sustainable yield is actually a little bit more complicated than that. So the kind of second kind of idea behind maximum sustainable yield is that, first of all, yes, you're not catching more fish than is being produced through reproduction. But the kind of other part behind this is that you keep the population of a fish at the size where the growth of that population is the greatest. Now, because depending on how big a population of fish is, that population is going to either grow fast or slow or at a medium rate. So first, let's focus in on this box on the left here. So what we have is population size, so how many individuals of fish are there on that population, and we have time over here. So if a population starts off with a very slow, very low amount of fish, then that population is going to grow very slowly. And that is simply because there's so few fish, it's hard for male and female fish to find each other and reproduce and have baby fish. So if there's very few individuals, it's hard for them to reproduce. So the population grows very slowly. So that's why the curve is going up very slowly here. You find the same thing when there is a lot of fish in a population, because when there's a lot of fish, now there's plenty of fish to reproduce with, so it's very easy to find mates to reproduce with, but now the resources are getting scarce. So the food that is available to that fish might be scarce, or the shelter available to that fish population might be scarce. So when populations are at very big numbers or very small numbers, their growth is very slow. But in the middle, that's when the population is growing the fastest, right? So where this curve that you see here, where this curve has the steepest slope, where it has the steepest angle, that's where the population is growing the most. So this is when the most new baby fish are being produced through reproduction. So kind of the idea behind maximum sustainable yield is that if you can keep the population at this level right here, that's when it's reproducing the most, and that's when it's producing the newest baby fish per year. Meaning that at this level, you can catch the most baby fish per year because, as we learned just a minute ago, as long as you only catch as many fish as are being produced by reproduction, then you can keep, catching those fish at that rate and the population isn't going to decline because the fish are essentially replacing themselves. You're only catching as many fish as are being produced through reproduction. So that is kind of the overarching idea behind this principle of maximum sustainable yield. You catch fish so that they are at a population level where they're growing the fastest, and you only catch as many fish as are being produced by reproduction. That way the population doesn't dwindle down to zero. So that's kind of the idea behind it. If you I want you to, just think about this idea, from a practical standpoint. So think about this, how well would this actually work, in practice? And what has been kind of found in general is that it typically doesn't work very well in practice. And a lot of why it is because it's very hard to estimate just how fast fish are reproducing. It's very hard to estimate, how many fish there are in a population, because fish are underwater and it's very hard to go down there and to count those fish. Because of that, maximum sustainable yield has not really worked out that well in the past. Uh, but kind of the general principles behind it, are, kind of useful. In general, if you only catch as many fish as are being produced each year, then the population should, not dwindle down to zero. So this is kind of what I was getting at before, right? So it's often more complicated because it's very hard to estimate the population sizes of fish, and it's hard to estimate, how much fish are reproducing. So because of that, typically how fisheries are regulated is with more than just maximum sustainable yield, right? So there's a lot of regulatory tools that are used for regulating fishing to keep fish numbers from dwindling down to zero. So let's talk about some of those regulatory tools. One of which is what's known as size restrictions. Uh, and the idea behind this is typically you want to let fish or crabs or whatever get up to a certain size. You want to let them get so that they're big enough so that they have reproduced, meaning that they have replaced themselves before you go and catch them. Because if you're catching too many baby fish, those baby fish haven't had a chance to replace themselves and to make more baby fish. So if you let them get up to that size before you catch them, then in practice, or in theory at least, the fish population should do okay, because they're being allowed to make more fish before you catch them. So what you see here is a Dungeness crab. In this yellow tool is what's known as a crab checker, which I know sounds like a kind of a gross thing, but in the context of Dungeness crabs, a crab checker is essentially something you hold up to the shell of this crab, and if the width of this shell meets a certain dimension, meets a certain length, then you can keep the crab. If the crab is too small, then you have to put it back because it hasn't gotten big enough to reproduce yet. So those are how size restrictions work. Method restrictions is when you only allow certain gear to be used. Because certain types of gear are just way more effective at catching fish than other types. It is way easier to catch a lot of fish with a midwater trawl than it is to catch fish if you're using one line and one hook. So a lot of times there are restrictions on what gear you can use to catch fish. Another really important regulatory tool are marine reserves. So these are areas where fishing is not allowed, where you have to let those fish just stay there and do their own thing. And the idea behind these is that, oftentimes a marine reserve is placed where we know that there is some critical habitat for a fish, meaning that maybe juveniles are there, or maybe that's where a lot of reproduction happens. And so we set those areas aside to let fish just do what they naturally do, so that then the whole population of fish can be healthy because that really important area to them is protected. And then, fish will move out of those areas where then they can be caught when they're not in those areas. So that's the kind of general idea behind a marine reserve. So we do have some marine reserves here in Southern California. So all of the red areas are federally regulated marine reserves, or red with these hatch marks through them are federal marine reserves. Solid red are state marine reserves. Purple are state marine reserves. Same with blue and purple. So there's a lot of different, types of regulations that can be put in place inside of a marine reserve, and you can see that there is quite a few down here in Southern California. So for instance, like off of there's an area off of Palos Verdes, which has some protection. In Point Dume, there is some protection. And then if you look out at some of the Channel Islands, so like around parts of Catalina Island, around part of Santa Barbara Island, the same with the islands that are kind of off of Ventura, like Santa Cruz, Santa Rosa, Anacapa, San Miguel. Those islands have some protection around them. So these are areas where you're not allowed to catch fish, where those fish are just allowed to do their own thing. Okay, so some of the other regulatory tools that exist include quotas. So this is just putting a limit on the number of fish that you can catch per day or per season or per person. And so this is a good way to kind of enact maximum sustainable yield because you put an actual limit on how many fish can be caught per year. The same with seasons. So this is when you say, okay, you can only catch fish during this particular time of year, right? So for instance, with a lot of like lobsters and salmon and things like that, there's only certain times of year where you're allowed to go and catch those things. And what permits do, this is when you have to apply to either the state or to the federal government or to maybe a local municipality. You have to get a permit in order to go fishing. And what permits do essentially is they limit the number of fishers, because not everyone is going to be willing to go and pay for a permit to go fishing, or even just to go apply for a permit to go fishing. And the idea behind that is that it prevents all of our waterways from looking like this, where people are shoulder to shoulder, catching all the fish that are in the ocean. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how those regulations are doing. And so we're going to kind of mostly talk about what's going on a global level, right? So what is the current status of global fisheries worldwide? Okay, so the first thing that I want to show you is some data from a paper by a really famous fisheries scientist who is in a university up in Nova Scotia. He's got a really gross name. His name is Boris Worm. But despite having a really gross name, he is a really famous and really important marine fisheries scientist. He did this really important paper where he looked at fishing data from Japanese longline fisheries from the 50s up until today. And so what you're looking at here, all these colors, these colored areas represent places where Japanese fisheries, Japanese longline boats were going and catching fish. And what the colors represent is how many fish they were catching per hook. And so blue or dark blue means that they're catching less than one fish per 100 hooks. So that means that that is an area where the fish have been depleted and there's not a whole lot of fish there anymore. Because if you put out 100 hooks, you're catching less than one fish per hook. Whereas the red areas are places where you're catching more than 10 fish per hook. So you have a much higher success rate, which would indicate that there's a lot more fish in that area. Right, so back in the early 50s, already around Japan, right? So here are the islands of Japan. Already around Japan, there was already kind of low amounts of being fish caught per hook. And that's because they had already started to deplete the fish that were in their local waters. But throughout the rest of the South Pacific, it was pretty good. They were catching quite a few fish back in the 50s. Okay, so let's take a look at what at this same graph, but so this is what it looked like in 1997. So of course there are two really important things that you should be noticing here. First of all, the Japanese fishing fleet was everywhere by the mid 90s, and I'm not in you know in the point here is not to single out the Japanese as being particularly you know destructive in terms of fishing. Pretty much all countries are doing some form of fishing, and a lot of those forms of fishing are can be kind of destructive. But this is just the data from the Japanese longline fishery. And you can see that they kind of had spread out throughout the rest of the ocean in their fishing. And you can see that mostly it's blue now, whereas they're catching a lot less fish per 100 hooks, worldwide. And that is really, it's just indication that there's a lot less fish in the ocean now than there was back in the 1950s. And a lot of why there's less fish is just because we've caught a lot of those fish. And unfortunately, we caught a lot of those fish before we could really even recognize that there was a problem. So that's one thing that I want you to kind of take about the global fishing, about what's going on with it. Another kind of important thing goes back to this graph that we looked at. And so this guy, Dr. Daniel Pauly, he's a really important, another really important fisheries scientist, also from Canada. He's at a university in British Columbia. And he is the person that kind of put together this trend that we see here, where there is increases in the amount of fish being caught through the early 1990s, and then a flatlining from then going on. So the thing about this graph is that actually until about the mid 2000s, we actually thought that it was still going up, right? So until the mid 2000s, what we thought was this graph looked something like this, that we were still catching more and more fish each year. But what Dr. Daniel Pauly found out was that in one country, they were over-reporting the amount of fish that they were catching, right? So what he found, in fact, was that in that country, they were actually starting to catch less fish. And so then it became clear around the mid 2000s that in fact, this is what the graph looks like. That in fact there's been a flat line in the number of fish being caught since the early 1990s. But it took them 15 years to figure that out because this country had kind of hidden that. And so the country where that happened was China. You might remember that in that graph I showed that showed all the different countries, the number of fish being caught in China went up and up and up until the early 90s and then flatlined. But what was happening in China was that people that were regulating the fisheries there, they were getting paid more if the numbers kept going up and up and up. So essentially, those individuals were just making up the data. They were lying about how many fish were getting caught. But then it became clear, then the work of Dr. Pauly essentially showed that those people were lying, that in fact they weren't catching more and more fish in China each year. So that was a really important thing because, up until the mid 2000s, there was a lot less cause for concern because, as long as people were still catching more and more fish, it kind of meant that, okay, things are okay because at least there's more fish to be caught each year. Uh, but since we now know that fishing is kind of flatlined since the 1990s, that shows us that there is a major problem. That even though we're still trying to catch more and more fish, we're catching the same, right? So we're putting in a lot of effort to catching fish, but we're still catching the same amounts. And why we're catching the same amounts is just because there's way fewer fish in the ocean than there was in the past. So essentially what Dr. Pauly found was that, the 1950s up until the present, there was a there's a 5 times increase in the amount of fishing effort. So essentially we're trying 5 times harder to catch fish now than we were in the 1950s. Because essentially we're spending more time fishing and there's more people fishing than there was in the 1950s. But since the 1980s and early 90s, the amount of fish being caught worldwide has become stagnant, has become flat, because there's just less fish to catch in the ocean. Yeah, another kind of important worldwide fishery trend is another thing that Dr. Pauly discovered, and that's what's known as fishing down the food webs. So this is a graph from a paper that Dr. Pauly published. And what this is showing is the average trophic level of fisheries. So remember, trophic levels is kind of like the placement of something on a food web. So a really high number, that would indicate things like sharks and in tuna, in swordfish, the apex predators that are at the top of the food web. Whereas low numbers indicate smaller fish and shrimp and things like that are kind of closer to the bottom of the food web. And so what Dr. Pauly found was that over time, from the 50s going up through the 90s and today, there's been a general decrease in the in the average trophic level of the fish that we are catching. So essentially, we are catching things that are lower and lower and lower on the food web. And the mechanism for this is essentially we start at the top because things like tuna and swordfish are really delicious and they're big. And so those are the fish that we want to catch and we want to eat. But as those fish get depleted, then we switch to something that's a little bit smaller and a little bit less delicious. Then we switch to something even smaller and even less delicious. And we keep going lower and lower and lower on the food web. So as we deplete what is going on at the top of the food web, we move further and further down the food web and catch things that are lower and lower on the food web. And so that is, of course, also cause for concern because we know that a lot of those things at the top of the food web are very, very important to their ecosystems, right? We've learned, for instance, how things like sharks can have really big effects on the functioning of coral reefs by limiting the middle predators that limit the herbivores that limit the algae. So this is another kind of concerning thing about global fisheries. Right. And so kind of what this all kind of boils down to is that worldwide fisheries are not doing well. That a lot of overfishing has in fact happened. A lot of maximum sustainable yield has been exceeded. And so today it's estimated that something like 70% of marine fishes are in fact overfished. Right? We're doing a really bad job of catching fish at a sustainable rate. And the consequence of that is that it's harder to catch fish than it was in the past. And the fish that we're catching now is are a lot smaller than what we were able to catch in the past, right? So this is the catch of two different, trips in the Florida Keys back in the 50s and then today. And so you can see that back in the day there was a lot more bigger fish. There was more fish and there were bigger fish than there are today. And these two photos, really just kind of show the difference between, what it was like in the 50s when fisheries were still, in pretty good shape, and where they actually are now. So there's major, major problems with fisheries worldwide. And this isn't even, then talking about some of the other dangers of fisheries, because there are a lot of fisheries that are very destructive to the habitat in which those fishes live, right? So I mentioned bottom trawls before. Here's an actual picture of what a bottom trawl looks like. And you can see there are all these heavy chains and heavy boards in this net that gets dragged over the seafloor and just flattens the seafloor. Right, so that's very damaging because then all of the fish that then might live in this area, they're not going to live there anymore because all of that habitat that they were using is now gone. Another danger of fisheries is bycatch. So bycatch describes when you're targeting one type of fish or shellfish, but you accidentally catch a different type. And what often happens is those different types, you might not necessarily be something that you want to eat. So they get brought onto a boat. They're sorted out from the things that they were trying to catch, and they're just put back in the water. But typically, there's going to be a lot of mortality of those things that are put back in the water because they were in a net and they were brought up onto a boat. And so by far the most damaging bycatch comes from shrimp trawling. So a lot of shrimp trawling, those nets catch a lot of different things, not just the shrimp. So particularly with Gulf shrimp, the shrimp trawling industry produces a huge amount of bycatch, right? Almost 50% of the total weight of the things that they caught is not actually what they're intending to catch, right? So that other 50% of stuff is just thrown over the side back into the water, and a lot of it, is dead because it's been up on the boat, right? So bycatch is another really really damaging part of this. Right. So, but I do want to make clear that that even though there are major major problems with fisheries worldwide, I don't want all of you to get incredibly angry at fishers, because remember fishers are people too, and those fishers are just like any of us. They're just trying to do whatever they can to support their families, right? That's all anybody could hope to do is to make a living and support their families. Where you should place more of your anger is at big corporations that are funding fishing, right? So big corporations like the Mitsubishi the Mitsubishi Corporation, in fact, that makes a lot of electronics and used to make cars. They are actually, supporting large scale global industrial fishing that's having a very, very negative impact on things such as Atlantic bluefin tuna. Right. So what I'm getting at here is don't hate the fishers. They're just trying to do what they can to support their families. Where a lot of the problems are is that big corporations that are involved in fishing are just ignoring regulations and ignoring science and just catching way too many fish. Right. So the fisheries industry does have a lot of problems, and a lot of it is with corporations and with the lack of regulations of those corporations. And I should point out that with fishing, there's not all doom and gloom. There actually are some success stories with fishing. So what you see here is an Atlantic striped bass. An Atlantic striped bass are a good example of a fishery that was facing major doom and gloom, but recovered through proper regulatory tools. So this is showing the commercial landings and recreational, well, commercial landings and then baby striped bass, from the 60s, up through the 90s at least. And what you see was there was huge amounts of striped bass through like the 60s and 70s, and then they just absolutely plummeted, almost to zero. And why that happened is because, first of all, we were catching way too many of them, and a lot of the habitat where they lay their eggs was getting polluted with toxins. But so we realized, when this happened, so in the early 80s, people realized, well, striped bass are going to go extinct unless we do something about it. So they cleaned up the areas where they were laying their eggs, and really good regulatory tools were put in place to make sure that we were catching striped bass. Right. So, for instance, on striped bass, in most states where striped bass exists in the Atlantic, you can only catch a certain number per day, and there are size restrictions. Right. So, for instance, this striped bass, it was pretty close. So this was like maybe a 26 or 27-inch striped bass, but it wasn't quite big enough, right? So we put it back in the water safely because it wasn't over 28 inches. And so the striped bass swam away and then could get bigger and make more baby striped bass. So there are good regulations in place for striped bass, which is why their populations have been increasing, right? So this shows us that, that we have the tools to make a lot of these fisheries, recover. It's just a matter of there being political will to put those tools in place. Okay, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about aquaculture, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what we can each individually do to help out with fishing, with fisheries. So aquaculture, as I mentioned before, is the farming of things that are in the ocean or aquatic organisms in general, so freshwater things in general. And so in a lot of cases, these are a really good alternative to catching wild caught things. But aquaculture isn't like the be all end all, the sort of solution to worldwide fishing, because there are some problems that come along with aquaculture. So there are some sort of practical problems, like within aquaculture, pens. So what you see here, it's a big pen, and there's a lot of fish that are inside of there. There can be really big problems with disease and with growing conditions. Because if you have all these fish in this one area, if one fish gets a disease, then they're all going to get a disease, right? So there's kind of the practical, side of things that it's actually hard to do this. There's, issues with these things getting out, especially if you are growing a fish in an area where it doesn't normally grow, right? That can potentially be problematic with invasive species, which we've talked about here and there throughout the semester. Of course, there are issues with nutrient pollution, because you got to feed all these fish that are in this pen, and all those fish are going to poop and pee, and all those nutrients can cause eutrophication and issues, in this area. And kind of the biggest issue with aquaculture comes with aquaculture of large predatory fishes. So, for instance, aquaculture salmon, aquaculture tuna, the big issue with a lot of those things is what to feed them. Because you can't just take a salmon and feed it soy, or grains, because they're carnivorous. They need protein. They need animal protein in order to grow. And so, what is typically fed to salmon and tuna that are in aquaculture is fish that are caught in the ocean, right? So, things like anchovies and herring are caught from the ocean, ground up into fish meal, and then fed to those fishes that are in aquaculture, right? So, this is problematic because in that case, aquaculture really doesn't solve the problem at all, right? The problem is that we're catching too many fish from the ocean. But if you need to catch fish from the ocean to feed the aquaculture fish, then you're really not solving the issue, what you're really doing is just taking, those anchovies and just converting them into things like tuna and salmon, right? Which is kind of silly because you could just go and eat that anchovy rather than eating the tuna and the salmon. In general, when you do this, it takes something like 5 pounds of anchovy to make 1 pound of salmon, right? So you're actually losing out on biomass, right? It makes way more sense just to eat those anchovies than to eat the tuna or the salmon that are grown in those pens. So for large predatory animals, aquaculture is definitely not the solution to these issues. But for things like bivalves, things like oysters and clams, with those things, aquaculture is great because those things are filter feeders. And they just sit, in the cage and they just clean the water, right? So they take, they take food particles that are in the water, and they just take them out of the water and they feed on those things. So with things like bivalves, you don't actually have to feed them anything to grow in aquaculture. So for bivalves, aquaculture is great, right? It's a way better to have aquaculture oysters and clams than it is to like have wild caught oysters and clams. But for large carnivorous fishes, aquaculture is not the solution. And in fact, it's damaging because for every 5 pounds of wild caught fish, you're only producing 1 pound of aquaculture fish. Okay, so let's talk about what all of us can do. Right. So first of all, so first of all, if you are a person that goes and catches fish, consider, catch and release, so catching those fish just for fun and putting them back in the ocean. And if you do that, make sure to be gentle. And of course, only target things that are sustainable to be caught. Right. So for most of us, the way that we interact with the fishing industry is as being consumers. So eating fish. And so for most of us, the way that we can enact, good changes on worldwide fishing is just by paying attention to what you eat, paying attention to what fish you are consuming. Because if us consumers stop eating things like Atlantic bluefin, which are in dwindling numbers, then people are going to stop going and catching Atlantic bluefin because if there's no demand for that fish, then people just aren't going to go and catch it. So the way that we can really, enact change is by being choosy about what we eat. But of course, a lot of us, might wonder, okay, so do I have to memorize a list of which fish are okay to eat and which fish are not okay to eat? Of course not, because there's a lot of fish to choose from. So, but of course, there are very good resources out there to help us choose which fish are okay to eat and which fish are not okay to eat. Probably the best one is made by the Monterey Bay Aquarium, up in Monterey Bay, California, and they produce something known as the Seafood Watch. So it used to be that they would make these little cards that you could keep in your wallet that would tell you what fish are the best choices and which are the fishes to avoid. But of course, now we all have smartphones, and now they have an app. So there is a Seafood Watch app that is, available for iOS and for Android. And how this app essentially works is if you go to a restaurant or go to a grocery store and you're looking at the fish and deciding which one to eat, what you can do is you can just put in some information to the app about what fish you're looking at, whether it was caught as a live fish or if it's aquaculture, and where did it come from. And the app will then tell you whether that is a good fish to eat or if it's a fish that you can avoid. And if it's a fish that you can avoid, what might be some good alternatives to that particular fish, right? So if you are a person that goes and eats fish, I'd highly recommend downloading this app so that you can be sure that the things that you're eating, are not having a negative impact on the ocean, and a negative impact upon those individual species of fish. Okay, so that's all I have to tell you about, food resources from the sea. In the next chapter, we're going to talk a little bit more about some kind of other impacts of humans on the sea, aside from catching food from the sea. And we'll talk about how we can help with those particular impacts.